And now I will hand over to Raniyah, our moderator. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I am an analyst at Polar Capital. I'll be moderating. If you have any questions, if you could either post them in the chat function or in the Q&A, and I will try and address them during our conversation. But if everyone else on the panel would be so kind as to introduce themselves and just say a little bit about their role and how ESG takes shape in their role, and just explain what ESG is for those of us who might not know.
Yeah,
Katherine, do you want to start?
Yeah, so my name is Katherine Davidson. I'm a portfolio manager at Schroders, which is a big investment management group in the UK, and I run our flagship sustainability fund. So it's a global fund investing in the equity market, aiming to invest in the most sustainable companies in the sense that they have good ESG practices and positive impact, etc. I think it'll be an interesting discussion because I suspect we'll discover that we all have slightly different nuances of what we mean by ESG or sustainability. And there's a lot of different terminology in the space, but I think of sustainability as being about the durability of a company over the long term, and that in order to secure that, a company has to have good relationships with its stakeholders, because ultimately there's a kind of corporate karma that, how a company behaves with regards to its stakeholders impacts investors in the long run. Sorry, that was a slightly long-winded introduction. Thank you.
Kristen?
So I hand over to Kristen.
Yeah.
Great. Kristen Weldon. I'm the Global Head of ESG and Impact Investing at Partners Capital. Partners Capital is what's called an outsourced chief investment office. So we manage the entire portfolio for private individuals as well as for endowments and foundations. So Coventry University is not a client, but many other UK universities are, where we manage the entire endowment. And my role actually has many different parts. As it relates to ESG, so environmental, social, and governance investing, I spend time with our asset managers that we invest in across every asset class and evaluate how they integrate those considerations into their investment process, as well as their risk management process, and then look to how they measure outcomes and whether their performance benefits from that integration. I also work with a huge range of clients and help them develop responsible investment policy. So what they want to achieve with their investment portfolio in terms of having a positive impact on people and the planet. Then finally, the impact investing side of my role, we define a little bit differently, I think, to the rest of the investment world, but we talk about investing in high impact companies and sectors. So areas like the environment, as well as social oriented investing, so things like healthcare and life sciences, all things where we look to achieve a positive impact and great financial returns, but also looking for the best outcomes to create a more sustainable planet. I hand on to Eleanor.
Thank you very much, Kristen and Katherine. Hi everyone, my name is Eleanor Keane. I'm an associate at Asper Investment Management. Asper is a specialist investment firm of a very different, much smaller scale than Schroders and Partners. But we invest directly in sustainable real assets, greenfield assets, including things like renewable power, heat networks, and other clean infrastructure. We've obviously been investing in this space for quite a long time, for over 10 years. So Asper was relatively early into the space. And legacy is one of the company's core values. And so at the heart of that really is sustainability, creating sustainable businesses. So ESG factors are very central to our mission and what we stand for. And it's not just about compliance with environmental, social governance factors, but it's about our investment approach, creating successful businesses, as well as the firm's governance and management practices. I've been with Asper for about 2 years, and my role is on the investment team, and ESG is relevant to that in pursuing existing and new initiatives with the companies that we manage, and really making sure that we're performing to the best of everyone's ability and creating a meaningful impact.
Okay, great. Well, I guess we can all agree that ESG is becoming more popular and more widespread, or at least we're having more conversations about it. So I just was wondering what all of the panel thinks. Why do you think, like, what's driving the change in ESG investing? Eleanor, do you want to start? Not to put you on the spot.
No, of course. I think in particular on the S and the G points, the environmental point is obviously, you know, the increasing attention on climate change and increasing urgency of the climate crisis. On the S and the G points, I think that the financial crisis actually played a large role in forcing companies to change their governance practices. And then also recent controversies like the Volkswagen emissions scandal, or BP, Deepwater Horizon oil spill, have really demonstrated the risks associated with good governance, or bad governance rather. So it's becoming much more well understood that a lack of good governance practices, a lack of sustainable social practices are having a significant impact on the long-term returns, viability, risks associated with businesses. I think a better understanding of that has been a key part in driving the change. And there are a bunch of other reasons which my panelists want to step in on.
Yeah, I'll jump in and add a few more, quite a lot of factors going on here. I was going to try and simplify it into like the demand side and the supply side. That on the demand side, we're seeing more and more demand from end clients, so people like retail investors, pension funds, charities, universities, etc., to invest in line with their values. So people want to work for companies that they believe in the purpose of, and they think are doing the right thing, and they also want to invest in those companies. And this sort of awareness of these issues, as Eleanor said, has just been rising over the last decade. But really in the last couple of years, we've seen this huge wall of money move into ESG. So we've got about over 2 trillion now in the space across the industry. So that's the kind of demand side. And then the supply side is that the industry has responded to that by launching bajillions of funds. So I think now there's nearly, I think it's every other day, according to Morningstar, that a fund is transformed into an ESG or sustainability fund. So this is partly sort of cynical marketing, and it's partly investors also realizing, as Eleanor said, that there is a sort of business benefit to doing this. And the regulators have also got in on the act. So the European regulator in particular is set up all this really complicated taxonomy stuff to try and encourage more sustainable investing.
I would just also add that some of this isn't actually that new. If we go back even to the 1960s, you would have seen exclusionary investing, where some investors might say, don't want to invest in tobacco or firearms. And so that was the earliest version of ESG investing, or even what was called socially responsible investing. One of the other big changes, to Katherine's point, is really that demand, but also that this sector is more and more attractive to millennials. So when we look at even say the US market alone, I think it's 80 million millennials out of a broader 350 million person population. But these are people like yourselves who are going to be making these big investment decisions in years to come. So that's going to really drive more capital into this space, and probably more product development. So to the supply side of Katherine's comment as well, we should probably see more and more product, and hopefully better product also in time, because there's actually a decent amount of controversy of what's actually sustainable and what leads to better outcomes versus what just simply is trying to slap that on the outside of the tin and say that it's a good product.
And do you think that COVID has had an effect? Has it accelerated the shift or changed investors' mindsets?
I'll just continue on for a moment, because my most recent role before Partners Capital was working for an agricultural merchant. So we were in the middle of the global food supply chain and experienced a lot of disruptions over COVID. And what I saw coming out of that was increased focus from investors on making that more sustainable, more viable, making sure that those things don't break down, but also things like looking at human labor practices, how people are treated. There was a big controversy in the US where one of the big meat suppliers wasn't allowing their employees to socially distance in the factory. So a number of them came down with COVID, and almost the entire factory had to be shut down. And there was a big focus on that company and their employee practices. So I think that yes is the answer to your question. I think we'll see increased focus on this. And one of the great things that did come out of COVID, and there's very few good things, is actually really strong performance from the sector over the last year and a half. And I would expect that to be going on further.
Yeah, I would just echo that. And when I think about it, I sort of feel like 2019 was the year that E got a load of public attention. And we were all doing David Attenborough and Extinction Rebellion and stuff. And then COVID kind of brought the S bit of ESG a bit more into focus. And I think it gave people more of an awareness of the role that companies can play in society and social problems, for good or ill. And then we also had Black Lives Matter going on in the middle of all of it, which a lot of corporates got involved in too. And you saw companies being named
I don't know if it's just me, but Katherine, you've been cutting out for me.
Recording.
Sorry. Sorry about that. My VPN froze. Did you get all of or any of that answer?
I'm really sorry.
Okay, no worries.
Sorry. I don't. Such a
I would
shame.
just add a couple of things off the back of what's been said, and hopefully Katherine will be able to fill in the blanks when she gets back. But yeah, to add to the points that Kristen made, COVID really highlighted the environmental, economic, social crises that are occurring. It really accentuated a bunch of pre-existing problems, as well as obviously creating a whole host of more problems. But I think in highlighting that, it has placed even more emphasis on the demand side drivers to increasing ESG investing. And at the same time, people have accumulated, people have a lot more savings. And it's led to people being at home and retail investors entering the market. And we've seen how powerful that can be with all of the GameStop and everything that's been going on with meme stocks and that kind of thing. And so I think as you get more retail investors, young retail investors, that demand side pressure is increasing as well. And then, yeah, in addition to the how much less volatility there was in ESG types of investments over the last year, it's really been actually, yeah, quite beneficial, or it's just accelerated a transition that's happening already.
Great. Sorry about having lost you for a moment there, Katherine.
That's totally my fault, don't worry.
No, it's the Zoom world we all live in. So I guess you all kind of touched on this, that at different moments, different facets of ESG have had more of a focal point. So then in terms of measuring ESG, how do you go about doing that? And are there, like, for example, is social harder to measure than the environmental side? Yeah, if you could just touch on that.
Shall I start and see if I make it through a whole answer? I think it's really challenging, actually, and it's much more challenging than some of the sort of ratings agencies would have you believe. That I like to misquote Einstein, is it not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. So there's quite a lot of stuff in ESG that is just hard to put data points around. And as you say, especially on the social side, that like finding good evidence for a corporate culture at a company or employee satisfaction, you know, the companies choose what they want you to see. And often, I, as an investor, I sort of try and build up a picture of a company over sometimes years of having a relationship with them, and, you know, trying to reach out to other stakeholders, and they're, you know, looking at employee review portals, speaking to NGOs, speaking to their suppliers and their customers, and kind of doing a bit of detective work. And I think it's really hard to measure. And part of that just comes down to the fact that it's quite subjective. So what you consider to be sustainable or ethical may be slightly different to what I do. So no ratings agency is going to be able to tell you whether this fund is consistent with what you believe necessarily.
I would definitely agree with that. And I think that what is often required for a lot of investments that you make in this space is more of a proprietary approach, where you go in and define what actually matters to you as the investor or to the ultimate stakeholder, so your investors, and try to pull that data out of those investments as well. So there's still a lot of work to be done, and very little standardization across the space. But one other key thing to note is the industry is very much moving from simply looking at inputs to measuring outputs and outcomes as well. So it's not enough to just say that we think about these things any longer as we make investments, but it's important to think about what's the outcome of integrating, say, climate risk scenario analysis into your investment portfolio. What is the outcome of that, and what decisions do you make on the back of that information? So I think we'll see more and more of that outcome focus going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that being a direct investor, we see some of those challenges around how to determine what matters to us versus what matters to our clients, making sure that those are aligned. And we really have to gather proprietary data. You know, these are our direct investments. There's no scoring or rating that we can apply or that we can get from the companies that we're investing in. So Asper itself participates in several standardized ratings. So we participate in GRESB, which is a reporting framework that's very widely recognized for real assets. And then we're also a signatory to PRI. But in addition to that, Asper thought very hard about how to measure those outputs that Kristen was talking about. And so we measure ESG performance through a matrix whereby we look at our three stakeholder groups, which are our investments, our clients, and our firm. And then for each group, we have a specific set of goals and KPIs across each of the E and the S and the G. And so the whole business is captured by this matrix. We get data that we collect from the platform companies that we invest in. And then for data that relates to clients or to the firm, Asper itself, we'll go and get data from those individual groups. We then try and be as transparent as possible. So apply an industry standard where we can. If we can't, then we publish the definitions and the methods that we use, and include any specific, relevant notes so that everyone knows exactly what we're doing. So then we have a bunch of KPIs that we have available across all of the metrics that are important to us. And finally, next to that, we put a self-rating, and this all goes into a sustainability report, which is available to all of our clients. So we have a self-rating, which is an internal assessment of how we think we're doing against our goals, how much further we have to go. And as I'm sure we'll talk about later, a lot of these things are very long-term and they're challenging, by definition. So I think having that point for reflection to acknowledge where we still have a long way to go is something that we've all found to be very beneficial, and hopefully our clients see some value in as well.
You've all kind of addressed this, but I just wanted to dig a bit deeper. But in terms of how you actually think of the ratings agencies and whether they're useful, if they're like one of many tools that you use, or simply just they provide like a framework. Yeah, I'm just curious just to see. I mean, obviously, like, you know, in my own work, we use them a lot, but we're not an ESG focused fund. Yeah.
Might just jump in that we use this in a slightly different way, not necessarily ratings agencies, but using data from an MSCI or Sustainalytics or some of the other providers out there, which help us to look through our public equity portfolios and identify how much exposure we have to certain factors. So some of those exclusion areas that I mentioned earlier, but also things like the carbon intensity of our portfolio, or the number of companies in our portfolio that have diverse boards and have women on their boards. So that sort of data set allows us to comb through our portfolio and provide those outcomes to our clients. So we don't necessarily work with the ratings agencies per se, maybe some of the other panelists do, but I think there's been a lot of work done in terms of improving these data sets from the traditional financial data set companies as well.
Yeah, I'll add to that because I guess I probably have more interaction with them. So for anyone on the call who isn't clear, by the way, when we say ratings agencies, talking about companies like MSCI, Sustainalytics, Morningstar, that give a grade or like a mark out of 100 to individual companies and then to funds based on the companies that they hold within them, to say sort of how sustainable they are. And as I alluded to in my previous answer, and I totally agree with Kristen, that there is really useful information in their work and that we can use that as one sort of input. What I'm not really comfortable with is sort of synthesizing all of that to try and get to a single number, which is adding sort of false precision to it. And they're quite opaque, and they don't agree with each other. So it can get very confusing because you can be looking at the same company and it can be top of one person's leaderboard and bottom of another's. So the correlation between the three big ratings agencies is about 40–50%, and that compares to about 99% for credit ratings from an S&P or a Moody's, just because there's so much subjectivity there. My other bugbear with them is that about 2/3 of the metrics that are in there tend to be sort of based on, does a company have a policy or a strategy, or do they disclose something? Whereas, as the other panelists have said, the focus is moving much more to outcomes. So if a company reports its gender pay gap, but it's bloody awful, you know, do you necessarily want to give them credit for that over a company that just doesn't report but may well be doing the right thing if you do some digging?
Just finally, I would say that for us, you know, as I said, we do participate in these industry standard frameworks, but we've really found the being able to produce these bespoke KPIs for all of our investments has been a much more meaningful way to show what we're doing and what the investments are doing, rather than, you know, this one letter applied to all these multitude of different factors and outcomes and influences.
You've also, I think Kristen in particular has mentioned exclusions, but kind of along the same lines. Firstly, how much do you employ exclusions in your own investing when looking at your portfolio? And also, just when you engage with a company and you're trying to kind of measure output, is divestment a useful tool? And if you do use it, do you want to explain what divestment firstly is, and also, yeah, why you use it and how effective it is?
Not to wait to jump in. Do you want to go first?
Go for it, Katherine. All you.
Sorry. So divestment is just selling something. So selling a company where you don't agree with what they're doing, or whether you've tried to engage with them and they're ignoring you. And I would say that it is a useful tool to have in your toolbox as an active fund manager. So unlike passive funds, which are just buying an index and can't therefore sell anything that's in the index, it does kind of give you a last resort to vote with your feet if a company is being really stubborn and you don't, I mean, you wouldn't want to be invested in them if you don't believe in their strategy for the future. The challenge is that once you've divested, you can't really engage with them. You can have a lot more sway from sort of being inside. So it's, yeah, it is definitely a balance. And that's why I think exclusion strategies are quite a blunt instrument, because they don't differentiate between different companies in the same space that may have a great transition plan or maybe completely head in the sand about it. Personally, I didn't want to run the fund with exclusions. I think, as Kristen said, it's quite an old-fashioned approach to ESG or sort of ethical investing, and they can be like a bit weird exclusion screens. So if you screen for alcohol, for example, you end up losing quite a lot of retailers because they sell alcohol, depending on the level you put it at. And you're like, is that really what you're trying to do? But in actual fact, the fund I'm running has ended up having a sort of normal list of exclusions in all the sin stocks, basically. So alcohol, tobacco, gambling, pornography, though there's no stocks in that anyway, and arms would be the sort of big ones. And then fossil fuels, depending on who you're talking to, whether that's in or out. And we just found that when we were marketing the product in its early days, there were a lot of investors who just needed that cast iron guarantee that you weren't going to invest in that space, especially for like the charities and foundations market. They could believe in your process, and we could say we would never invest in a tobacco company given the way we look at companies, but they needed to be able to sort of put it on their documentation and to be like 100% sure that they weren't going to wake up in the morning and see their sort of name in the headline against this dodgy investment. So
I would just echo that. So we think about investing across a range of options, and exclusions is really sort of ESG 101, because it has been done for so long, and it's pretty simple, but it's a good way to align your portfolio at least with your values. So we see that a lot from, say, as Katherine said, foundations who have a particular mission. So if they're a healthcare foundation, they don't want to invest in tobacco stocks. That makes a lot of sense. It's pretty logical. On the divestment side, such a heated question. It can really get people quite fired up. But I think that the simple thing to say, to add to what Katherine said, is when you sell these positions, you just push them into the hands of people who don't want to do anything about it. And in the case of say, Western oil and gas companies, if their cost of capital increases so much and they're left with orphaned assets, those will be pushed to national oil companies or just polluting countries, which aren't really thinking along the same lines as you want them to think. So they're not focused on better outcomes in terms of pollution control or environmental standards. So generally an engagement approach can be more effective to achieve the results that you want.
Eleanor, do you have anything to add to that?
This is it seems to be a point focused on public markets, really. It's not something we would never have the opportunity to divest from a company that we didn't agree with, because we never would have invested in them in the first place.
Very much.
can I ask Eleanor a question? What do you do if a company that you've already got an investment in, or an asset that you've already got an investment in, starts going in a direction that you're not happy with?
Well, I think so. That's obviously a potential risk, but I think the risk of that happening is very, very small. So when we first choose to invest in a company, we typically look for a developer that has demonstrated experience, but is very much early stage enough that our capital is attractive because our capital is not the cheapest capital out there. So we're looking for early stage people who do not yet, and they're not of sufficient scale to access cheaper capital. And those developers that we're looking to work with have a demonstrated commitment to the values that Asper has as well. It's a really, really fundamental part of our screening process, is making sure that these values are aligned, and that these entrepreneurs and developers that we're looking to work with want to create a legacy with these companies as well, and create an impact as well. And fundamentally, these are renewable and sustainable assets that we're investing in. If a company were to, I guess, start underperforming in terms of these ESG KPIs, it's something that would have to be addressed. We obviously monitor it very closely, so hopefully we'd pick it up as quickly as possible before it got to a stage where it was problematic. And it's something that would be addressed through the board meetings that we have and the regular interaction that we have with these companies. And we really do work very, very closely with them. So yeah, if it ever were to happen, which hopefully it never would, and I can't imagine a circumstance where it would, because we trust these guys that we work with, then yeah, it's something that we'd actively address very quickly.
Interesting, thank you. Yeah, it's obviously quite a different world, because
Yeah.
in public equity, if you're trying to get the chief executive of Alphabet or Amazon to do something, you obviously don't have much sway. So yeah, very different setup.
Yeah, when we were 100% of the capital or something like that, then we have a lot more sway. Yeah.
So I guess kind of along those lines, Katherine, what kind of forms of do you mainly just have conversations and use voting as your main ways to kind of sway a company?
Yeah, that's pretty much the options that we have. I mean, we have conversations and letters. We can also do collaborative engagements where we team up with other people in the industry, which sort of increases your clout if you can get a bunch of investors together that do account for a much more significant portion of capital. It depends a lot on the size of the company. If it's a smaller company and you're a larger proportion of their shares, then you can generally have a bit more influence. Also, if it's a company where you kind of built a relationship. So a few of the companies on my portfolio I know sufficiently well, and we respect each other, that they will come to me and ask for advice on, we're thinking about doing X, Y, and Z. How do you implement a good net zero strategy, for example, was a company I recently had with a conversation I recently had with a Japanese company I own. So those kind of engagements can be really, really constructive for both sides. When it's a case of trying to correct something that you think is wrong, it can be a bit more fractious, and that's kind of where your voting comes in. You sort of use your vote to underline your opinions on things. So if a company's being really reticent on diversity, then you start voting against the chair of the nomination committee on the board, for example. So things like that. You can post shareholder resolutions as well to at AGMs, which are quite a popular way now to try and get sort of ESG factors on agendas. Yeah, it's certainly not a quick battle, and it's not always easy, but I think there are quite a lot of places where investors together have started to drive positive change in the industry. Kristen could probably add to that.
Yeah, does anyone have anything to add to just in general engaging with companies, best methods, most used methods, most topics most engaged about? You mentioned diversity as one. I'm assuming climate is a hot topic.
Climate's certainly a hot topic, particularly in the UK ahead of COP26 this autumn. But there's a number of organizations which help with this, one of them being Climate Action 100 Plus. And so they focus on the top 100 emitters, I guess, across the globe. And the engagements are organized around those particular names. So if you own one of those names, or if you have particular interest in engaging with one of those names, it's great to go in through an organization like that to organize and facilitate that engagement. I think to Katherine's point, sort of it's not so much safety in numbers, but it's more impactful in numbers. So joining up with like-minded investors to either exert some pressure on a company when you want to affect change, but also then just getting more leverage for your activities as well.
Makes sense. And then I guess for all of you, I mean, ESG is always considered as part of your, I mean, for Katherine, obviously, but it's never not a conversation. And yeah, I guess also in terms of just because it, as many of you have said, like when did you first begin to think of ESG as ESG instead of just like a normal part of investing? Does that make sense?
I think I know where you're going. I think to some degree, as Kristen said earlier, it's kind of always been there. And it's for any kind of, especially for people like Eleanor who are investing in real assets, considering the governance practices and the environmental practices, etc., of a company that you're invested in is really part of your fundamental analysis. So it's kind of arbitrary whether you decide to break it out and call it ESG. And I think part of that has sort of been that supply side response, the sort of keenness to label things. But pretty much everything in almost the entire investment universe now, I would say, claims to be at least ESG integrated. So people take account of these things when they're making their investment decisions. And you know, things, when you're thinking about things like climate change, they are just, they're no longer separate from the financials. They're all kind of tangled up. If you're going to have a cost of carbon, or you're going to have catastrophic risk to your assets, then that's not something that kind of exists in its own little bubble and only, you know, ethical investors care about. So it's quite a blurry line now, I would say. So even the other portfolios in my on my team at work that aren't sustainability badged, they also look at it, but the difference is that they can choose where they draw the line. So I will only invest in companies, you know, above a certain threshold. They can invest in tobacco or big oil or something if they think that the ESG risks are priced in, so they're still going to get a good return for investors. So there's a trade-off there, whereas in mine it's a slightly different opportunity set.
Go ahead, Eleanor.
Thank you. Yeah, just to follow on, as Katherine said, it's so what I'm doing at the moment is ESG stuff. It is truly fundamental to the investment decisions that we make. And just as an example, in our investment committee papers that we put forward for a recent one that we did, we have an ESG section within every paper, and it's getting bigger and bigger by the day, but it's always a couple of pages. And for this most recent one that we did, we've done a lot of due diligence on the investment, and the ESG section ended up essentially just being paragraphs out of the commercial due diligence that we've done, the operational due diligence, the financial due diligence, the technical due diligence, everything else that we look at in the business. Every like kind of way that you slice it and dice it has an ESG component. And so it's yeah, truly fundamental. I think the only kind of nuance thing we have to respond to is when our clients have a very specific request, a very specific need. It's almost always something that we would have looked at before, but sometimes they'll have a very particular methodology for a KPI that they want to look at, that kind of thing. And as we talked about right at the beginning, our clients, big institutional investors, are seeing more demand from their ultimate clients for specific ESG things, goals, objectives, and so we're seeing that demand from our clients increasing as it kind of flows through the ecosystem.
For me, it's across everything that I do, just given that my role is head of ESG. But we look at private markets and public markets. And so it's such a great position to be in, to see a range of approaches in terms of integration. And what I say to a lot of our clients is, you're getting this no matter what. So you may or may not know that you have this in your portfolio, but we will look at every manager's practices. And the best thing that can happen really isn't that it's an additional layer, that it's truly integrated into an investment process, from looking at screening an investment, underwriting that investment, managing it, monitoring it throughout, and then exiting it as well. So, I think the real kind of aspirational goal for this space is to have it be just part and parcel of what you do every day, no matter what your asset class is. And I think we'll continue to see that move that way, and you'll see more of a blurring of lines between what's called an ESG fund or a sustainable fund and just simply a fund.
Great. And then in terms of just challenges within ESG investing, like obviously there are a different set of challenges for, say, a fund at the beginning of its journey, and then one which is steeped in the space. So do you want to cover the different challenges that different investors on different spectrums of the journey face?
I think the greatest challenge to start is really the one about data. So it's just not good enough yet. And we need to, hopefully get to a point where it's more consistent. I think Katherine mentioned it earlier, but if you look at a variety of providers rating a company's ESG characteristics, one provider might look at, Facebook completely different to the next one. And so, we need some sort of consistency around that data provision and the outcomes coming from that data. So I think that's a real challenge. But I think also the measurement of outcomes is the next big question to determine the answer to, which is, that's great that you're thinking about these things as you make investments, but that should lead to better performance and obviously a better impact in terms of people on the planet. But how do we measure that and really convey that to a wide variety of stakeholders? And that's the real question that consistently comes up as you think about ESG investing.
I think for me, the biggest challenge day to day is that everyone, that there's so much product in the space. It's incredibly competitive, but there's a lot of not great quality stuff going on, in my opinion. Kristen will have a better overview of the market, but it makes you a bit cynical. And it's quite hard to get your sort of message across to clients when it's this very crowded marketplace filled with people doing very different things and all using the same terminology. I'm not really sure what the answer is, because I'm not sure any of these taxonomies are going to solve the problem, but it is a sort of daily frustration. It's almost like greenwashing is what we call it when it's kind of done at the company or the investment level, and now you're kind of getting it at the fund manager level as well. But everyone, as we said in the last answer, everyone's like, oh yeah, we do ESG integration, but that could be as simple as applying a screen from a third party, or it could be as in-depth as what Eleanor does. It's a huge spectrum.
Very much a personal view, and it's a specific point on an ESG goal rather than ESG investing, because I think that we've talked about the obvious barriers to ESG investing, but I think that just the long-term nature of these points, and this speaks to the difficulties of data collection, is that a lot of these things, we're going to see it happening and having an impact over 10 years or something. But I think within that long-term impact, one of the specific points within ESG is about diversity, and particularly in the spaces that we're investing in. This is investment management in the energy sector in Europe. So diversity is a challenge, and the most important thing with diversity is we know that diverse teams they create more impact, they're more innovative, they're more creative, but it takes real work and it takes time to see changes flowing through. And with this point, you have to make sure that everyone on the team is empowered to and has a real voice, and that you have diverse voices on the team, as well as the team needing to be diverse. And so that is a lot harder than just hiring a bunch of people who all look different. It's the difference between having diverse statistics and then giving diverse people voices. And that's what's going to make the biggest impact. And it just takes a long time to feed through. And sometimes, personally, I feel myself being impatient. But yeah, I think that's certainly a challenge that I personally experience.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we actually have a question about gender lens investing, and whether it's effective. And I'm curious to hear everyone's thoughts.
No one has
it. Well, I would just say that gender lens investing is, clearly something that, very relevant to what I was just talking about. And one of the first ways to start looking at this is getting those diverse people in investment seats as well. Just a brief thought.
I actually had to look up gender lens investing because I wasn't entirely sure what it covered and what it didn't cover. And it seems to, again, be quite a broad spectrum, from trying to invest sort of very actively in sort of impactful, female-owned businesses, etc., and a much broader approach that just kind of takes account of diversity at the companies you invest in. I think the former is probably quite challenging in public equity. I think you could do it in private equity, sort of direct investing, but yeah, it's stock markets is going to be very hard to get something that's a direct play on that. On the other hand, like, diversity is one of the things that we're looking for at every single company that we invest in. It's one of the areas that we most actively engaged on, and as Eleanor said, we have great evidence that diverse teams produce better outcomes. I would say that probably gender lens is it's too narrow nowadays, because we've, especially in the last year, we've had so much more focus on ethnicity since Black Lives Matter, etc. And we're also now talking about sexuality, diversity of backgrounds and thought, which is the investment industry is not good at many of these, unfortunately. In terms of people running money, it's about 10% of fund managers are women. I'd say it's slightly better in the sustainability space. And if you were to try and do a straw poll, anyone who hasn't been to a Russell Group university, I reckon that would be an even lower number. So as Eleanor said, I think we need to have that slightly broader spectrum approach rather than just focusing on gender.
We have a question from the audience. Someone has asked, how do your investment management firms differentiate itself in terms of performance in the ESG space?
I think that, just to go back to my earlier point, we look to integrate these ESG factors throughout our investment process, look to our underlying managers that we invest in and see what they're doing, and then measure and report that. So that's a little bit how we distinguish ourselves. And you can sort of educate yourself on different processes and different firms, many of which are now publishing ESG annual reports to show what they're doing in this space. But the performance measurement side is really a challenge. So we'll continue to do it. We'll evidence our amount of integration that we're doing, as well as the performance of our products that are dedicated to the ESG space. But we won't really have any real firm conclusions on whether this leads to better outcomes, I think, for some time.
Yeah, I would agree. It's pretty much impossible to strip it out as a factor in performance, because as we've been talking about, it's like very grey where the line ends for fundamental investing and ESG. So we again can look at the performance of our funds that have ESG in the name, which have generally outperformed their sort of normal counterparts in the last couple of years. But in terms of the firm differentiating itself rather than an individual product, I would say that Schroders has put quite a lot of focus in the last couple of years on trying to sort of practice what we preach as a corporate. So making more sort of corporate level commitments, like founding the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, which aims to make all of our investment portfolios net zero by 2050, implementing sort of better policies in how we run our offices, trying to get our own diversity up, sort of recognizing that it's a bit hypocritical for us to go out and ask other companies to do these things if we're not doing them at home.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I think you really have to practice what you preach. And as far as Asper is concerned, our approach to that has been to adopt this 3x3 matrix where we have investments, clients, firm across the ESG. And it's things like, for example, making sure that or monitoring and providing in this report how much we're participating in industry events, like how many partnerships are we creating, and those are things that typically would not be reported, but you create influence and expand and increase the conversation about these important topics, and across all of the different initiatives at those three levels, the investments, the firm, and with our interactions with our clients, it all adds up. So I think that's how we try and differentiate ourselves and also make the information available.
Just to add again, and the reporting thing on the manager side is definitely becoming a much bigger thing, that we're demanding more of our companies and our investors are demanding more of us. So we also now produce like a massive engagement report every quarter where it goes like through the details of all the companies we've engaged with, how we voted on every single resolution is completely transparent. And considering we do thousands a year, and we're also now producing sort of more impact reports as well. So there is a growing burden on us too.
Yeah, sorry, just a quick follow-up. Is the impact report different to the engagement report?
Yeah, so I think in public markets at least, the impact report is much more about looking at the impact that your investments have on the world, rather than the impact that you have on your investments. So it's sort of one step removed. It can be related, but yeah.
Got it. Just interesting to know that there's such demand for, I guess it makes sense to measure the output.
Yeah, well, we tried to develop, we've got a tool called SustainX, which was developed by a guy on our head of sustainable research, which tries to quantify the sort of dollar value of all of the positive and negative externalities produced by a company beyond its financial profits. And it's obviously not a perfect tool, but it really resonates with clients being able to see how their portfolio stacks up on things like the SDGs or environment, emissions versus the benchmark, etc. So that's kind of what we mean by impact reporting.
Super interesting. So yeah, I guess for someone much younger, also, by the way, we have 5 minutes, so if anyone has any questions, please feel free to just pop along a last minute one. But for someone young who is looking to enter into the field and is very interested, what advice would you give about impact investing in general, or just anyone who is at a firm where they're earlier on in their ESG journey and they want to make a difference?
I'll jump in first. I think it's great if people are interested. I think follow your passion. That's one of the great things about finding something that you're interested in, because then you can invest so much more of yourself into your role. So I think it's great. But I think also there's so much available to learn more about the space and what's happening. So if you go on to different websites, impact management project, or there's another institute, or the GIIN, Global Impact Investors Network, all these things show a number of papers to educate yourself in different frameworks and different standards that are developing. So it's a great way to sort of be cutting edge. The other area that's, I think, interesting is if you want to be more qualified in, say, the ESG space, there is a CFA certificate, and there's also another standard through the, I think, the Accounting Standards Board, or you can also get a qualification. So it's a great way to learn about the space and have something to prove it as well.
Just a quick question has just popped up, and then if you can bundle your answers. How could we as individuals in FSCS-backed invest in FSCS-backed ESG funds? Any platforms for retail investors to do this?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember exactly which platforms my fund is on, but it's a UK registered FSCS fund. I think it might be on Hargreaves Lansdowne, but it's we've got a UK domiciled line. Can maybe follow up on that. Go on the website.
Yeah, if not, we can email Adeduni and Agnes and get that information to you. Eleanor and Katherine, any advice for someone looking to get into the space?
Yeah, Kristen covered a lot of the resources I was going to mention. So those are great resources, and it's a really fast moving space. So don't be overwhelmed. Have something that you believe in a way that you think that is the right way to do it. The most important thing when we've been interviewing recently for people has been sort of passion and commitment. Skills can be taught, but enthusiasm can't really. Be curious. But you're in a good space because this is a ridiculously hot area of the labour market at the moment, and we are struggling to fill seats. So I would say, even if a role isn't perfect, get your foot in the door, and then it's much easier to move within a company or to move to a different company once you've already got a bit of a track record.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. And this is more, I guess, advice that is relevant to people once you do have your foot in the door. But I feel quite strongly that everyone who is in this space should individually feel a responsibility to kind of claim a voice. And if you have thoughts about how a process that you see going on, internally or in your investments or whatever could be improved, then we have a responsibility to speak up, and shouldn't be shy to do so, because it will make this whole process go a lot quicker if we do.
Great, I would agree with you. Any parting comments? Literally have 2 minutes.
Oh, just say that you could be doing to get on your CV to get a better idea of what's going on in the space. So you're doing the right thing by showing interest.
Absolutely. And good luck. To Katherine's point earlier, it's constantly changing. So don't feel intimidated, and just start learning, and that will make it, I'm sure, a very interesting career path.
Yeah, absolutely. I would just echo that, and thanks everyone for coming along.
Yeah, thank you all. I hope you enjoyed. I think if Adeduni and Agnes want to say something.
Yeah, so I would just like to thank our panelists for volunteering to participate in our event, and thank you, Raniyah, for moderating. I would also like to thank all our attendees. If you have any questions, just send them to me, and I'll try to see if our speakers can answer them, and I'll try to get a reply to you. But yes, thank you everyone, and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.